Welcome, friend. This story may be the reminder you've been needing that even in the darkest moments, God is working. Watch until the end, and if it touches you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. The Fateful Turn. The Nevada desert stretched before Jake Reeves like an endless canvas, painted in shades of amber and gold as the setting sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape. The roar of his Kawasaki Ninja filled his ears, drowning out everything but the rhythmic pounding of his heart. At 24, Jake lived for these moments, the rush of adrenaline as he pushed his motorcycle to its limits, the wind tearing at his leather jacket, the world blurring into streaks of color as he accelerated down the empty highway. "Come on, baby," he whispered to his bike, leaning forward until his chest nearly touched the fuel tank. The speedometer crept past 120 miles per hour, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Jake had been the rising star of the underground racing scene in Las Vegas for 3 years now. His reputation preceded him, the fearless rider who took corners at impossible speeds, who raced like he had nothing to lose. Perhaps he didn't. Since dropping out of college and walking away from his father's construction business, Jake had built his life around these fleeting moments of freedom on the open road. Behind him, the distant rumble of motorcycles grew louder as his friends struggled to keep pace. Tonight was just a practice run for the big race this weekend, an illegal street competition with a 50-0 prize that had drawn riders from across 3 states. Jake had no doubt he would win. He always did. As the road curved ahead, Jake saw his opportunity to push even harder. This particular bend, locals called it Devil's Elbow, had claimed more than its fair share of reckless drivers over the years. A steep cliff fell away to the right, with only a flimsy guardrail separating the asphalt from a 100-foot drop. "Let's show them how it's done," Jake muttered, downshifting and leaning into the turn. Later, he would struggle to remember exactly what happened next. Some said a patch of gravel had caused his rear tire to lose traction. Others claimed a desert jackrabbit had darted across the road. Jake himself would never know for certain. What he did know was the sudden sickening sensation of momentum gone wrong, the bike sliding out from under him, the screech of metal against asphalt, the world spinning as he was thrown clear of his motorcycle. There was a brief, weightless moment when Jake realized he had cleared the guardrail entirely. Then came pain, darkness, and silence. The steady beep of medical equipment was the first sound Jake registered when consciousness returned. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, as though they were glued shut. When he finally managed to force them open, harsh fluorescent light assaulted his vision, causing him to wince and turn away. "Welcome back," a soft voice said from somewhere to his left. Jake tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. A straw touched his lips, and he gratefully sipped cool water. "Easy now," the voice cautioned. "You've been through a lot." As his vision cleared, Jake found himself looking at a woman in blue scrub-searly 30s, with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell, RN. "What?" Jake croaked, then swallowed hard and tried again. "What happened?" Sarah adjusted something on his IV drip before answering. "You went over the guardrail at Devil's Elbow. A family driving back from Lake Mead saw your headlight go over the edge and called 911. Search and rescue had to rappel down to reach you." She paused, her expression serious. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Reeves." Lucky wasn't exactly how Jake felt. As awareness returned, so did the painless symphony of agony across his body. His left leg was suspended in traction, encased in a complex frame of metal and pins. His right arm was immobilized against his chest. Bandages covered much of his torso, and he could feel the tight pull of stitches across his face. "How bad?" he managed to ask. Sarah didn't sugarcoat it. "Compound fracture of your left femur, 3 broken ribs, broken right clavicle, various lacerations and contusions. Minor internal bleeding that we've managed to control." She checked his chart. "You've been in and out of consciousness for 3 days, but this is the first time you've been lucid enough for a conversation." Jake closed his eyes, letting the reality sink in. 3 days. His bike was certainly destroyed. The race would happen without him. The realization hit him. Part of everything he had built his identity around had been stripped away in an instant. "Anyone come to see me?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. A flicker of sympathy crossed Sarah's face. "We contacted your father. He sent some clothes and personal items." She gestured toward a small duffel bag on a chair in the corner. "He said he'd try to visit when work allows." Of course, Robert Reeves wouldn't abandon his only son entirely, but he wouldn't interrupt the workday either, not for the disappointment who had rejected the family business and everything it stood for. "Your friends from the racing scene came by the first day," Sarah continued. "But hospital policy only allows immediate family in the ICU. They've been calling for updates." Jake nodded slightly, fighting against a wave of self-pity. His racing buddies would move on quickly enough. In that world, yesterday's champion was easily forgotten. "How long?" he asked. "Until you're back on your feet?" Sarah adjusted his pillow with practiced efficiency. "The orthopedic surgeon will discuss your recovery timeline, but you're looking at several months of rehabilitation at minimum. The femur alone will take significant time to heal properly." Several months. The words fell like a prison sentence. Jake turned his face toward the window, unwilling to let this stranger listener see the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'll let the doctor know you're awake," Sarah said, seemingly understanding his need for space. "Try to rest. The call button is right here if you need anything." As she turned to leave, Jake noticed she had left something on his bedside tableau, small paperback book with a simple blue cover. The title, embossed in silver lettering, read, "The Journey of Faith." "What's that?" he asked. Sarah paused at the door. "Just something that helped me through a difficult time once. No pressure to read it." She offered a small smile. "But you might find it has something to say to you when you're ready to listen." With that, she was gone, leaving Jake alone with his pain, his thoughts, and the unexpected gift from a stranger who seemed to see something in him that he had long since lost sight of himself. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of pain, medications, and the mind-numbing routine of hospital life. Jake endured it all with growing bitterness, snapping at nurses, refusing physical therapy sessions, and generally making himself as difficult a patient as possible. Only Sarah seemed immune to his attempts to push people away, meeting his hostility with unwavering patience. One particularly bad night, when pain had kept him awake for hours and the walls of his hospital room seemed to be closing in on him, Jake found himself reaching for the book Sarah had left. He had ignored it for days, dismissing it as religious nonsense, but desperate for any distraction, he opened to the first page and began to read. The book wasn't what he expected. Rather than heavy-handed preaching, it was filled with stories, real accounts of people who had faced devastating circumstances and found renewed purpose through faith. A soldier who lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan. A woman who survived cancer against all odds. A former addict who turned his life around after hitting rock bottom. Jake read until dawn, something stirring within him that he couldn't immediately identify. When Sarah arrived for her morning shift and found him still awake, book in hand, she said nothing, but her small smile spoke volumes. "This guy," Jake said, pointing to one of the stories. "The one who was an alcoholic who crashed his car and killed his best friend. How do you come back from something like that?" Sarah pulled up a chair, something she rarely had time to do during her busy shifts. "You don't come back?" she said quietly. "Not to who you were before. You move forward and become someone new, someone stronger, someone who carries that experience as part of them, but isn't defined by it." Jake stared at the ceiling, considering her words. "I've been racing since I was 16, he finally said. "It's all I know, all I'm good at." "I doubt that very much," Sarah replied. She hesitated, then added, "Can I tell you something personal, Jake?" He nodded, surprised by her use of his first name. "I was a lot like you once, always chasing the next thrill, living like there was no tomorrow." She rolled up her sleeve to reveal a tattoo of Phoenix rising from ashes. "I was into rock climbing. The more dangerous the climb, the better. My friends and I would tackle routes without proper equipment just for the rush." Jake could imagine her younger self, fearless and defiant, not so different from him. Then one day, my climbing partner fell. The rope that should have caught him had frayed against a sharp rock edge. I watched him drop 300 feet. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected old pain. After that, I couldn't even look at a climbing wall. I felt lost, angry at the world, angry at God. "What changed?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. Sarah smiled softly. "Someone gave me that book, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in my pain. That my suffering could have meaning if I let it transform me rather than destroy me." She stood and straightened his blankets. "I went back to school, became a nurse. Now, instead of risking my life for a thrill, I help save others. The rush is different, but it's deeper, more lasting." As she turned to leave, Jake found himself asking, Do you think I could find something like that?" Sarah looked back at him, her expression serious. "I think you've been given a second chance, Jake Reeves. What you do with it is entirely up to you." The book became Jake's constant companion in the weeks that followed. As his body slowly began to heal, something else was healing, a spiritual wound he hadn't even known he carried. The stories in the book led him to ask questions he had never considered before, about purpose and meaning beyond the temporary high of speed and danger. Sarah brought him a Bible, and together they would sometimes discuss passages during her breaks. Jake discovered that faith wasn't about rules and restrictions as he had always assumed, but about transformation and grace concepts he desperately needed in his current state. 1 month into his hospital stay, Jake received an unexpected visitor. His father, Robert Reeves, stood awkwardly in the doorway, cap in hands, his weathered face a mixture of concern and discomfort. "You look better," Robert said gruffly, taking a tentative seat beside the bed. Jake nodded. "Getting there." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. 5 years of estrangement creating a chasm wider than either knew how to bridge. "Your bike's totaled," Robert finally said. "Insurance won't cover it, illegal racing and all." "I figured." Robert cleared his throat. "The guys at the shop chipped in and got you this." He placed a small portable DVD player on the bed. "Thought you might be bored." The gesture, so unexpectedly thoughtful, caught Jake off guard. "Thanks, Dad. Tell them I appreciate it." Another silence, less strained this time. "I've been doing some reading," Jake said, gesturing toward the Bible on his nightstand. Robert raised an eyebrow, but made no comment. "Makes you think about stuff," Jake continued. "Like where I've been heading, what I've been doing with my life. That nurse Sarah, she says you might be released in a couple of weeks to a rehab facility." Robert hesitated. "Or you could come home. We've got the downstairs den. Could fix it up for you until you're back on your feet." The offer hung in the air between them. 5 years ago, Jake had stormed out of that house, swearing never to return, determined to prove he didn't need his father's life or his father's approval. "I'd like that," Jake said quietly, "if you're sure." Robert met his son's eyes for the first time since entering the room. "I am." It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Neither of them was the kind of man who found emotional conversations easy. But it was a beginning, a small step toward healing a relationship that had seemed beyond repair. After his father left, Jake returned to his reading, a sense of peace settling over him that had nothing to do with the pain medication flowing through his IV. For the first time since his accident, he felt something like hope, not just for his physical recovery, but for something much deeper. The rehabilitation center was Jake's home for the next 3 months. The work was grueling, learning to walk again on his damaged leg, rebuilding strength in his broken body, enduring pain that sometimes left him breathless and discouraged. But unlike his stay in the hospital, Jake approached his rehabilitation with determination rather than resentment. Sarah visited regularly, even after he was no longer her patient. She brought books about faith and recovery, and more importantly, she brought friendship, something Jake realized he had never truly experienced among his racing companions. "I've been thinking," Jake told her during one visit as they shared coffee in the rehabilitation center's garden, "about what comes next, after all this." "And?" Sarah prompted. "I can't go back to racing. Not just because of my leg, but because he struggled to articulate the change within him. It feels empty now, like I was running from something rather than toward something. Sarah nodded, understanding without him having to explain further. Remember that guy in the book? The one who travels to schools talking about his experience with drunk driving? Jake continued. I've been wondering if maybe I could do something similar. Talk to kids about taking risks, about the consequences, about finding purpose in something more meaningful than the next adrenaline rush. I think you'd be amazing at that, Sarah said, her face lighting up. You've got a powerful story to tell. Jake smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I've been praying about it. First time in my life I've ever really prayed about anything. It feels right, you know? Like maybe this is what I was meant to do all along. The realization had come to him gradually over long nights of reflection. The accident that had seemed like the end of his life was actually the beginning of something new, a second chance to make his existence matter in ways he had never considered before. There's a youth group at my church, Sarah mentioned casually. They do an event for high school students every few months. The guy who was supposed to speak next month just canceled, if you're interested. Jake felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of public speaking, but also a surge of excitement unlike anything he had experienced on a motorcycle. He said, I'd like that. I really would. 1 year to the day after his accident, Jake Reeves stood before an auditorium filled with high school students. His left leg still bore the scars of his injury, and he walked with a slight limp that would likely never fully disappear. But as he looked out at the sea of young faces, he felt stronger than he ever had racing down desert highways at dangerous speeds. My name is Jake Reeves, he began, his voice steady and clear. And a year ago today, I died on a highway called Devil's Elbow. The audience fell silent, captivated. The doctors brought me back, but the man who woke up in that hospital wasn't the same one who went over that cliff. Jake moved across the stage, his limp a visible reminder of his journey. I'm here today to tell you about that man, who he was, who he became, and how he found something worth far more than any race he could ever win. As Jake shared his story, the recklessness, the accident, the depths of despair, and the unexpected path to redemption, he saw recognition in the eyes of many students. They knew what it was to seek validation through risk, to confuse danger with meaning, to mistake speed for purpose. I thought I was free on that motorcycle, Jake told them, his voice passionate, but I was actually in prison trapped by the need for the next rush, the next proof that I was alive. Real freedom came in that hospital bed when I realized that my life had value beyond what I could prove with my next stunt. In the back of the auditorium, Sarah stood watching with tears in her eyes. Beside her was Robert Reeves, his face a mixture of pride and wonder as he listened to his son speak with conviction and purpose. After the presentation, as students lined up to talk with Jake, a young man in a leather jacket waited until the others had gone. He approached nervously, hands shoved in his pockets. I race bikes, he admitted, not meeting Jake's eyes. My friends and we've been doing it at the quarry outside town. Last month, one of us wiped out pretty bad. He's okay, but he finally looked up. How did you know when it was time to walk away? Jake placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. When you start asking that question, you already know the answer. He said gently, the hard part isn't knowing what to do. It's finding the courage to do it. As the student nodded and turned to leave, Jake felt a profound sense of fulfillment. For each person who heard his story and reconsidered their own path, the pain of his journey had meaning. His scars, both physical and emotional, became not just reminders of what he had lost, but testaments to what he had gained. Outside the school, as Jake walked toward his father's waiting truck, Sarah fell into step beside him. So, she said with a smile, what did you think of your first official speaking engagement? Jake looked up at the sky, a brilliant blue canvas stretched over the world, the same sky that had watched over him as he raced recklessly through the desert that had witnessed his fall and his rebirth. I think, he said slowly, that I finally found my road, and this time I know exactly where it leads." As they reached the truck, Robert stepped forward and, in a gesture that would have been unimaginable a year ago, pulled his son into a tight embrace. Over his father's shoulder, Jake's eyes met Sarah's, and in that moment of connection, he felt a certainty that transcended all doubt. The fateful turn that had nearly claimed his life had instead given him something infinitely more precious: a purpose, a faith, and a future filled with the opportunity to transform other lives as his own had been transformed. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges and setbacks, days when the physical pain of his injuries would remind him acutely of all he had lost. But Jake Reeves was no stranger to difficult journeys, and this time he wasn't traveling alone.